Say hi to James. Getting ready to go live.
You streaming on Facebook?
Mm-hmm. On my own personal page.
All right. About to go live. I'll cue you.
Okay.
You're listening to From Classroom to Newsroom, a show about journalism education, and education journalism on WFMP LP, Louisville 106.5 FM. Today, the entire hour is going to be devoted to both journalism and education. In a way, we're going to focus on one big single issue, and that is the ongoing attempt to delegitimize and defund public schools here in Louisville, Kentucky. This has come up in the news often recently. In fact, on past shows, we've talked about charter schools, which are used as a method to funnel public money into private hands, as discussed in episode 4. And on episode 3, with JCPS school board member Chris Kolb, we looked at a November 2017 opinion piece by Jordan Harris of the Pegasus Institute, where he argued that a state takeover of JCPS would be really great for the children of Louisville. Here's exactly what he said, quote, "A state takeover is a great opportunity for change. This is not because KDE, Kentucky Department of Education, is particularly qualified to improve outcomes, and we shouldn't expect it to." Close quote. So, if the goal is not to improve outcomes for JCPS students, then what is the goal? Well, one possibility, a very strong possibility, is that the goal ultimately is to privatize education, to take advantage of these exorbitant tax breaks and tax shelters that the charter school industry has access to, and most definitely to snatch some public money from public coffers. JCPS had a $1.4 billion, with a B, billion-dollar budget last year, and in the eyes of these venture capitalists, real estate magnates, CEOs, tech libertarian bros, and so on, that money is just being wasted, not because it's not actually helping kids, but because it is not going into their pockets. And as discussed in episode 4, the Associated Press found that charter schools are among the nation's most segregated. And as we know, high segregation correlates very strongly with low achievement, probably because those schools tend to draw highly from impoverished communities and don't have the human capital or social capital that a school full of kids with very affluent parents does. And yet, every single local defender of charter schools talks about how our local public schools are underserving minority youth. And the thing is that they're right. The numbers don't lie, right? There's a huge achievement gap when it comes to racial and ethnic minorities versus the majority, or kids from impoverished families versus kids from well-off families, or ESL students versus native language speakers. So they're right. There's a problem. But their solutions are useless. So far, we've heard 3 solutions from this crowd. Number 1, get rid of busing and implement charter schools. House Bill 151 last year. Number 2, use public money to fund charter schools. And then number 3, have the state take over JCPS. So we already know that 1 and 2 will lead to segregation, which has already been shown to correspond with low academic achievement, so they can't be serious about those 2 solutions. And this third solution, well, that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. And this is where the journalism aspect of this comes in. Thanks to the reporting of the intrepid reporters at Insider Louisville, Caitlin Bowling, Boris Ledwig, and Joe Sonka, big shout out to them. We now know that there is an organization, a local organization called the Steering Committee for Action on Louisville's Agenda. And the acronym there is SCALA, which for my money they could have done a lot better. You know,
Yes.
A lot of rich people, they could have come up with a better acronym. How about Steering Committee to Help Out Our Louisville? That would at least spell school, right?
Oh, yeah.
But it doesn't matter because Kentucky journalist Ray Hodge proposed an even better name for SCALA, which is Illuminati, which is perfect, the Louisville Illuminati. So henceforth, the Illuminati. So anyway, these 3 reporters at Insider Louisville exposed the existence of this group, and the Courier and Insider have done a lot of follow-up articles since then. And by the way, the group insists that it's not a secret group, even though they never announced their existence, and no one can come to their meetings, and they're not interested in public input, and even the mayor showed up, and somehow there was no public record of the mayor's attendance. And one of the things that we learned about Scala is that David Jones Jr. is a member, and the group spent $50,000. It's $50,000 or $20,000? $50,000 to commission a report from this company called Bellwether, which is largely funded by conservative groups and charter school advocacy groups. But here's the thing. They didn't want an objective report. They wanted something to confirm their existing hypotheses. And the report even says that. And if you look at it, Insider Louisville has published the entire report, and I'll put a link to it on the web for the show later. The third paragraph of this report, it says, and this is a direct quote, "The Education Study Group of the Steering Committee for Action on Louisville's Agenda approached this opportunity with the hypothesis that governance and leadership structures in the district must change in order for JCPS to successfully enact ambitious academic reforms and see all students reach their academic potential." And then skipping down to the next paragraph, "This policy brief summarizes Bellwether's research as well as the perspectives and recommendations of ESG, Education Study Group. Views expressed in this brief are those of the ESG alone." So in other words, they gave Bellwether $50,000 for them to write a study and then endorse Scala's conclusions, which were baked into the report itself. And what did this secretive group of CEOs conclude? That JCPS needs a strong CEO, that the state needs to take over, that we need to get rid of the superintendent and the school board and have a strong executive come in and clean house. What a surprise. It sounds very transparent and democratic to me. I wonder if they would like to apply that solution to other areas. Let's just get rid of all the democratically elected representatives and bring in a strong, central executive who will then be able to really make big changes. I think we have a word for that type of political system where we get rid of the democratically elected leaders and install the centralized unitary executive. What's that word? I'm not sure what that word is called.
Dictatorship? Oligarchy?
Something like that.
Yeah.
This seems like a good time to introduce today's guest. She's one of the co-founders of Dear JCPS and Save Our Schools Kentucky. She's a parent of a JCPS graduate from a quote-unquote failing JCPS school. And that graduate, by the way, is now at the U.S. Naval Academy. So
Yes,
the school can't be that bad.
Double majoring in nuclear and mechanical engineering.
See? And last year, she warned Kentucky legislators that if they voted against public schools, she would find people to run against them. And she's making good on that promise. Gay Adelmann, welcome to From Classroom to Newsroom.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with this Bellwether report and Scala and that whole mess. So have you read the report yet?
I have looked over some of it. There's been so much information that has just been bombarding the scene in the last couple of days.
Right.
The thing that I was most interested in about the Bellwether report was the funders that are associated with that group. If you look over who funds the Bellwether group, it's charter schools, it's the Eli Broad Foundation, it's online voucher, online educational organizations like HIP, and every third name is charter this or charter that. It's groups that are intending to privatize public education. Clearly that's the agenda.
And so, elected officials would argue that I don't vote a certain way because my constituent gives me money. The constituent gives me money because I vote a certain way, right? It's not a bribe. It's like a reward, right? They're supporting me for my position. The Bellwether people would probably argue the same thing. Like, oh no, we're like an independent, nonpartisan research foundation, and these people are just supporting us because they support our mission. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we have all these think tanks out there, like the Heritage Foundation, for example, which is, consistently turns out policy reports endorsing conservative causes, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. This is true of left-wing think tanks too. They never come out with a conclusion that upsets their funders. And so I'm pretty sure that Bellwether is probably also not going to come out with a conclusion that upsets their funders.
Yeah, that's a good conclusion.
Right? Mm-hmm. So in the very first page of this report, to this Bellwether report, in the introduction, we're about 5 or 6 paragraphs down, it says, as a result of its study, deliberations, and discussions with local and state stakeholders, the Education Study Group has concluded that structural change to district governance and leadership is required to achieve the dramatic improvement JCPS students deserve. Mm-hmm. Now notice they said, as a result of their discussions with local and state stakeholders. Who are those stakeholders? Did they talk to any students?
I don't know.
Do they talk to any parents, teachers, principals?
I don't know. I'm a pretty outspoken parent and taxpayer here in Louisville, and nobody contacted me.
They did not consult you on this, did they?
No, they did not.
So yeah, when they say discussions with local and state stakeholders, I think what they mean, because there's no evidence otherwise, what they have to mean is members of SCALA.
Yes,
right?
That's the way I would interpret that as well.
Right, and how many public school advocates or representatives are there in SCALA?
I didn't see any.
We can say, I mean, David Jones Jr., he was on the school board.
Oh, true, but we did vote him off the school board because we didn't like the direction that he was taking our district when he
I
served.
thought that was interesting because here he is trying to take the district in his own direction in a rather undemocratic way with this group that meets in secret, that doesn't have public meetings. They're making backroom deals. They're contacting Bevan. They're meeting Bevan. They're talking to people in Frankfurt. And they want the state to come in and take over, which to me doesn't sound like something we would do in a democracy where we eliminate all these democratically elected officials and their, the concerns of their constituents and their interests, and instead bring in this agenda from the state level government, which doesn't seem, I don't know, it doesn't seem very democratic to me.
No, and I thought they were all about local control too. There's no local control when they do, well, I guess they are trying to get their own local control.
Right.
But this reeks of arrogance and someone who thinks because they have been successful, and I don't know how, when you're born into an elite environment in the first place, I don't know how successful you can really prove that you've been.
Right.
But because we've been successful, we know what everybody else needs kind of attitude. And I think, I want to believe that people have well intentions, that they go into this and they truly do want to fix problems that they identify. I've had prior conversations with David Jones, and we've agreed on the fact that the real solution to public education crisis is poverty. We have to fix poverty. And he was like, that's a whole separate conversation. I agree with you 100%. Like, fundamentally, we agree on these things. So to kind of work in an ivory tower environment where they come up with ways to fix a public school system without truly being boots on the ground, talking to the teachers, talking to the students, talking to the stakeholders, they just set themselves up for unintended consequences, no matter how well-meaning their actions are. So that's the part that concerns me the most about keeping, especially our most vulnerable minority populations, out of the conversation. I'm fairly new to Louisville. I didn't come until after, well, into the busing. Busing had been around for a long time before I got here. But the stories that I've heard about busing kind of sound very similar. Like there was a group that made some decisions about how we were going to integrate our schools, and there were a lot of unintended consequences that we're still paying for today.
Right.
And if we had gone about it in a more global,
egalitarian way?
Yes, where you actually heard from the people that would be living it and most affected by it, we might have made sure that we had minority teachers in those white schools that the minority students were being bused into, so that they had people who looked like them teaching them. We would have made sure that we didn't just say we solved the problem through busing, but we actually made sure we had an equitable housing plan in place, so that 30 years from then we would actually have desegregation in our community and we could end busing. But really what we've done is just propped it up by keeping busing going.
Prolonged the problem.
Exactly. And some, in most would argue, I would think that we've made matters worse in a lot of ways. So does that mean I think we should end busing? I think it needs some fine-tuning, but I don't think that House Bill 151, like we saw last year, is the solution. I don't think we need the state telling us how we should align our student assignment plan. I think that's the job of our democratically elected school board. And so this I know best, and you took too long, and it's a messy democracy is a messy process, and I don't have time and patience for that. So I'm going to tell you what to do. Creates so many unintended consequences down the road.
And one of the things that I see persistently in these conversations is that these proponents of eliminating busing and proponents of charter schools, proponents of this and that, whenever somebody criticizes their proposed solutions, one of their first responses is, well, why don't you care about kids, right? Like there's a problem here, and you're putting your head in the sand and ignoring the problem. But here's the thing. We can all agree that there's a problem and then disagree on the solution. Yes. And that's what's happening. He says we're disagreeing on the solution. And I've said this multiple times on this show, and I'll say it again. No one is saying, least of all me or you, that JCPS is it's perfectly fine the way it is.
Nope.
the status quo is excellent. Like,
No.
nobody is saying that. No one's saying that.
No, why do you think we formed Dear JCPS in the first place? It wasn't to promote status quo. It was to seek change within the district. We wanted more accountability. We wanted more transparency.
Right.
We wanted follow-through. We wanted authentic solutions to the problems that have been identified instead of sweeping things under the rug,
Right.
instead of kicking the can down the road, and instead of shell games. And when we found that we couldn't get those things addressed at the district level, a lot of times it was because of some state law that had the adults in the system doing things a certain way to keep from facing the consequences of some new accountability rule or some, overemphasis on some myth instead of the reality. And why we didn't get some people comfortable back then to push back on the state and say, wait, it's your laws that make us do these things.
Right.
We could be pointing out the fact that it's the funding that they cut back in 2008 that they've never restored. And, a lot of these problems that we know that we have behavior issues in our schools. We know that we have
Yeah, no one's pretending that's not a real thing.
Performance issues, exactly. Right. But we need to fund our schools. We need to be putting the supports into our schools that we took away back during the recession that have never been restored. And we need to stop trying to legislate our way out of this mess. Every time these well-intended bills come out with some new, how we're going to make everybody teach financial literacy, which is a bill that just is going through right now.
Or Bible literacy.
Oh, there's that. But they're not funded, so they're unfunded mandates. They keep passing more and more unfunded mandates.
Right.
And what that means is our administrators have to figure out how to work this into the curriculum now without giving up any other classes. And since things are on the test, well, then what's going to give is things that aren't on the test, like art and music and the things that actually make school enjoyable and fun and teach a well-rounded, deeper learning curriculum. So, and then we have our struggling schools. This is what I personally witnessed in my own son's school, is because it's a quote-unquote failing school, there's so much pressure on these schools to get there. What are you doing to get your score up? What are you doing to get your score up? So all the fun is taken out of the day. Everything is about the scores. The teachers and the administrators who are there for the right reasons and doing wonderful work for these kids are beaten over the head about their scores and demoralized because they didn't perform the same as a school across town that has a different dynamic and a different demographic attending their school.
Well, so plus the numbers game is rigged.
Exactly.
Right? So if I'm at this school and this year our accountability score is, let's say it's a 46, okay? So let's go on to next year, and next year I've got a whole new group of students, right? 3/4 of my students are the same, but 1/4 of my students are brand new. So I'm testing a new group of students. Like 1/4 of my students are brand new kids, right? And then next year, let's say I score like a 47 or 48, right? But here's the thing. If that 48, like that's improvement. I'm showing improvement. Even though I'm showing improvement in a new group of kids, like they should be measuring one group of kids and not constantly shifting groups of students. Right. So even though I've shown improvement with this new set of kids, if the 48 is still one of the lowest scores in the district, suddenly I'm a failing school. Yep. Suddenly we need improvement. Yep. The schools are all pitted against each other.
They are.
And there's no standard. The only expectation is you have to constantly improve your score, and whoever's the lowest score is a quote unquote failing school.
Right. So no matter how good you are, you could all be A+ schools, and there'd still be a failing school.
Or no matter how much improvement you've shown, you're still a failing school.
Yeah, and
it's
so it really flies in the face of their logic that we need competition in order to improve our public schools. Because we have competition in our district, and we've seen what that does. It pits schools against each other. Yeah. We can't. You may have a great idea over at Manual, but you may not feel comfortable sharing it with your next closest competitor because they might then leapfrog you in the scores next year.
Right.
So instead of a collaborative environment, we're creating a competitive environment, which sounds good if it's a business, but we're not manufacturing widgets, and you don't shut down. You shut down a failing widget manufacturer,
right?
Because for lots of reasons. But if you shut down a failing school, you don't stop manufacturing those kids. You send them to another school, so you're just shifting them around. So the kids who are constantly thrown under the bus, constantly the most oppressed in our society, are the ones that get shifted around each time.
Yeah.
And so
they're the ones who don't get asked, what can we do to make your education
nobody's
better?
in the school asking them.
Know.
Yes.
If you ask them, the kids will say, okay, teach me things that are relevant to my life. Don't condescend to me. Don't constantly focus on the sort of like rules and administrative apparatus of school. Like, let's focus on the lessons. Make things more hands-on, connected to the real world. Like, show me how I use this stuff. they know what's going to help them do better, right? Like
Yes.
they're the experts. They're the primary stakeholders, and yet
They are.
they're not consulted for the Bellwether Report.
No.
They're often not consulted about JCPS related decisions. And this is a little pet peeve of mine. Whenever local reporters do stories about JCPS, they don't ask students for their input. Like they're major stakeholders, right? They talk to Dear JCPS, they talk to parent group, talk to PTSA, they talk to Brent McKim of the teachers union, they talk to Marty Polio, whoever's the head of JCPS. They never talk to kids. They're the primary stakeholders. Why are we not talking to them? Nobody's talking to them. Oh, it really gets on my nerves.
Yeah, and teachers too. I mean, nobody's asking the teachers what tools they need to be successful. They just keep legislating more and more things from the
Right,
top.
more things for us to teach.
Yep.
Yes, put another paper on that pile. It's
Yeah.
fine. I'm
Yeah.
used to it.
And so I feel like like I said earlier, I think most of the people who are going along with this are well-intentioned, but I also think that there are some sinister forces within that are
Yes.
breaking our schools on purpose. And you mentioned the busing and the charters and the state takeover. I also think accountability is a key piece of that.
Right.
I mean, who doesn't want accountability?
Right.
When we say
No one's against
nobody's
accountability.
against it, but I actually ran into someone the other day that said you can never have enough accountability, and that statement just threw me for a loop because you can.
Yeah.
If you're constantly taking somebody's temperature all the time without actually administering medication or figuring out how
That's
to
a good
cure their
analogy.
disease,
That's great.
the accountability isn't solving anything. So yes, you can have too much accountability, and the way that ends up manifesting itself in our schools through the behavior and the failures that the failing scores, et cetera, are partly because of what I saw at my son's school. The emphasis on getting those failing schools scores up means that these students who didn't do well on K-Prep then have to take Coyote, then have to take ASVAB, then
Right.
have to take, so they're constantly being pulled out of meaningful instruction to
Right.
do test prep
More
for the
tests.
next test.
Yeah.
And so the ones who score the worst are the ones who are missing the most instruction, which is just baffling. Why?
It seems like a no-brainer, but
Yeah, but our legislators don't spend enough time in our schools to see how their laws actually play out in the real world, and that's the part that is so frustrating to me, is because we can't just come in and fix it at the base level and use common sense because we're so busy deflecting all these more and more well-intended but poorly thought out laws.
Right, and I want to extend your analogy a little bit about assessment and accountability and constantly taking a kid's temperature. I feel like, in some cases, all they're doing is taking the kid's temperature over and over again. They're not feeling her forehead. They're not checking her, see if her belly's swollen. They're not looking for night sweats or vomit. Like the only symptom they're looking at is the temperature.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so at some schools where the temperature is 98.6, they're just like, everything's fine.
Yes.
This school is perfect. Nothing's wrong.
Yep.
But then if it goes up to 100 or 96 or 97, like we have to do something, like the temperature's bad, right? But that's not the only sign that something might be either right or wrong.
Right.
And yet that's the only rubric that we use to determine how well schools are doing. Is this
And then
single score?
On top of that, what happens is parents flock to the schools that have good scores as if
Right.
that's going to magically make their student smart.
Right.
No, we ended up choosing the academy at Shawnee because it had a great aviation and aerospace magnet.
Right.
Not because of the scores, but because we toured the facility. We saw how gorgeous that building is. It really is a magnificent
It's
building.
beautiful. I used to teach there.
I know you did. And we met the staff, and we just fell in love with everything that was going on there. You could feel the energy. You could feel the momentum was moving in the right direction. So choosing a school simply because of its score, or even because it's what the neighbors think you ought to do, is actually detrimental, because when you flock to a school with a high score, if they're taking in high-performing students, then it's actually a lot more competitive. So.
Right. It's a higher stress environment.
It is a much higher stress environment, and so my son was given so many opportunities simply because it wasn't a competitive school, but the teachers are still fantastic. The opportunities are still there. You have to be an engaged parent, which is how I ended up recognizing all of these things that needed to be addressed and taking them on at the school board and now at the state level. But
and of course,
it becomes self-fulfilling. If everybody flocks to a certain school because of its score, then of course we just keep propping that up.
Right.
And then the kids that are left behind this is one of the reasons why we don't like charters.
Right.
Is because charters have the opportunity to cherry pick out, and then the public schools get left with the more expensive to educate kids.
Yes.
They take kids year round, whereas charter schools can only take them during enrollment, and then if they turn out they can't they don't have the resources to address a certain special need or whatever, they can kick them back to the
they're
public
out.
schools,
Back
but
to
the money
public
doesn't
schools.
come back.
Right.
So the public schools have this catch-all set of requirements that they have to fulfill, and everybody else gets to have the best of the best situation. And the idea that the money follows the child is another fallacy that I would like to speak about right now, because I'm a taxpayer. My son is no longer in public school, and but I pay taxes happily towards public schools because I want strong public schools in my community. Those dollars don't belong to the existing students; they belong to the public school that serves them.
Right.
And so some kids are going to cost more to educate, some are going to cost less. So the idea that there's a fixed dollar amount that follows these kids around no matter where they go is bogus. Because what's next after charters is online schools, and online schools don't have any overhead. They have very little, it's very scalable. They come up with a program, and whether they sell a 1 or they sell 10,000,
or whether it's a good program or a bad program.
And there's no teacher overhead. There's no brick and mortar overhead. There's no books, as far as I don't know. There may be some books, but it's done online. So the idea is that it's low cost, but yet that same dollar amount is allocated towards online schools too. So
just bringing it in hand over fist. Tons of profits.
Yeah, and it's taking it directly from our schools that our taxpayers are intended to fund. So as a taxpayer, that makes me outraged. That concept right there makes me outraged. And then now we've got these scholarship tax credits where the private schools and the Catholic schools are pushing to get people to get a tax write-off, not even a deduction. I want to make sure people understand the difference between a tax credit and a tax deduction. When you make a donation to a charity, you take that dollar amount off your adjusted gross income, and then you pay taxes on that lower dollar amount.
Right.
When you write a donation to, if we get scholarship tax credits, which is a backdoor voucher, really is what it is.
Yeah.
They came up with a fancy word. They do that a lot. They come up with
Part
pretty...
of the Koch brothers playbook.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
And they come up with these pretty words to keep people confused because everybody knows vouchers are bad now. The word got out.
Right.
So now they have this scholarship tax credit, which goes directly to the private school as a write-off on as a tax credit. So,
but here's the thing though about these credits is that is it's worse than vouchers.
Yes.
Because only people who can afford to pay tuition up front and then be able to deal with the whole tax refund aspect of it later.
True.
They're the only ones who can take advantage of it.
That's very true.
At least if you're impoverished and the voucher just pays for your kid's education. But with this way, you're still getting your kid's education is subsidized by the state. It's just that you get to, I'll pay a little bit now, and then I'll get this refund later. And not everybody can do that.
Well, and it's not even a refund. When you sit down to write your check to Kentucky for the amount you owe for taxes, if it's $5,000, you go and write it to the Catholic school or the private school instead of the state, and that credit is completely erased. It's almost dollar for dollar, the amount. And so that's $5,000 that now didn't go into the general fund that now isn't being spent back out on not just schools but roads and public services. So,
and as you know, Kentucky is an extremely wealthy state, so we can totally afford to give away all this money. We have no margin for error here in Kentucky. These other states that have experimented with it and are actually now moving away or recognizing the error of their ways and blocking these vouchers and scholarship tax credits had some margin for error in their budget. Kentucky has no margin for error. I don't even know how they think they can fund these charters. Like the idea that they passed a charter bill last year when they knew that we had a pension crisis and a budget crisis ahead of us is irresponsible. It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
It is. It really is.
I guess
which is why we're voting them out in November.
And then the thing is that their rationale is, it's not going to take money from public schools, right? Well, then where are they getting the money?
It's that the money follows the child logic, but that's not possible because our schools have fixed costs.
Right.
Our schools cannot just adapt when 10 kids at $6,000 each or whatever the dollar amount is leave. That's 2 teachers we have to cut.
Right.
That's not, we'll just scale it down. It doesn't work that way.
If you have a business, for example, a restaurant, and your restaurant, you have no customers one day, that doesn't mean you don't have any expenses that day. There's all the stuff you still have to do to keep the place open.
That's right.
So whether or not you have a sold-out night, whether you have 100 customers or you have 2 customers, there's an overhead there. And if you just give all the money away as these kids go to charter schools, which are the charter schools even going to be around in 2 or 3 years?
I don't know. One you were telling me about in Nashville?
Yeah, I saw in the paper the other day this Nashville kindergarten through 2nd grade charter school. I assume that as the kids got older, they were going to expand to 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. I've never heard of a school that's just K through 2. But anyways, a K through 2 charter school, and they just closed in the middle of the school year. And my thought was, look, like all these people argue is that it's for the kids, like we're doing it for the kids, we don't care about the money, we're not trying to undermine public education, it's for the children, right? Why would you close your charter school in the middle of the school year? And these are very young children. And you're leaving their parents high and dry, you're leaving the kids high and dry. Oh, sorry, we weren't making enough money, so bye.
That's the problem when it's for profit.
Right. It's the profit motive there.
And so where did these kids end up going? Back to public schools.
Right.
Where's the money that they had spent? Did the money come back? I doubt it, because they had to shut down. So and Nashville, speaking of Nashville, is the example that the Scala group is using as to who they're modeling after when they are coming up with this plan. But one of the things in one of the articles is that Nashville actually held 24 community forums where they sought public input and had an opportunity for those who are affected by these decisions to give input. And the Scala group hasn't had any public meetings. And in fact, when asked if the next one was going to be open, David Jones Sr. said no. And when asked why, he said, because I said so.
That sounds very democratic.
Yes, it does.
Sounds like a very totally upfront, democratic, straightforward, honest type of organization. All right, cynicism aside, now is a good time for us to take a brief break, and we'll be back with Gay Adelmann and a little bit more about journalism and education and Illuminati.
Let me see what kind of comments I'm getting here. People were telling me to...
I'm K.A. Owens, and you are listening to WFMP-LP, Louisville, Kentucky, at 106.5 on the FM dial. Forward radio, by the people, for the people.
Do you have any water?
I do. It's here in the fridge.
Are we back? How long?
No. We've got about a minute. I'm having myself in the water over here.
Still sideways. It says it's sideways, but people are watching. Sorry, we're on a break right now. I'm sorry if it's sideways or upside down. I've got my cord in. I'm charging it, so I can't set it on that end. But I'll keep it upside down, and thank you.
All right, so we'll come back and we'll talk about Dear JCPS and Save Our Schools specifically.
Okay.
And the type of stuff that they do.
All right.
Ready?
Yep.
All right, we're back with Gay Adelmann here on From Classroom to Newsroom. Gay, can you talk a little bit about the work that you've done with Dear JCPS, Save Our Schools? Can you tell us the difference between the two organizations and notable achievements or things like that?
I would be happy to. Okay, so Dear JCPS was an organization that myself and another Shawnee mom started almost 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
As parents at Shawnee, we felt like if the district could just help people recognize what a great program they have at Shawnee, and guide more families like my son and her son to Shawnee, maybe we could drive more people from east to west. One of the things that frustrated us was the fact that busing puts all of the burden on the families in the West End.
Right.
Like, if you look at a map, it's actually chopped up into like 12 or 13 checkerboarded pieces, and everybody's bused out of the West End. So Shawnee, being in the West End, they actually backfill. Like, the kids who go to Shawnee are not actually the kids who live around Shawnee. There is to the north and northeast, but really they're filling in from Portland. So just that idea that we've got all of the burden on the West End families is mind-boggling as well. I would like to see a more diverse busing program that we're sending just as many kids from east to west, and it can be voluntary as opposed to mandatory like we have right now. Is if we put more carrot out there, carrot instead of stick.
Right.
So, and
I think Shawnee's magnet programs are a great carrot.
It is. If they would just brand it and market it, like, they have to overcome the stereotypes that exist. And I myself and this other mom really felt like we had good testimonies that we could go out to the public and help them understand why they might want to send their kids to Shawnee. So we would go to showcases schools and let people ask us questions and made sure we had a good display, because the district did not provide a lot of support for schools like Shawnee to really have a good, strong presence at Showcases schools. And then obviously we have Thunder Over Louisville every year, and what a great place to recruit and make people aware of the program that we have at Shawnee. So we would get the simulators and get the teachers at the aerospace and aviation program to bring their simulators out and let the kids who are there at Thunder experience what it's like to fly a plane and learn and talk to the instructors and learn more about it. So we were doing things like that and trying to get them to help us with marketing and branding, and we really kept hitting our head against the wall year after year. Some obstacle would come into play where they said they were going to help us, and then at the last minute we couldn't get the list we needed, or we couldn't get the cooperation we needed, and principal was let go, and we went all summer without a principal because the turnover in our district, in our school in particular, is really high. Because they're beating these teachers that are working their rears off, beating them down and demoralizing them for the work that they do. So you can't blame them for eventually saying, you know what, I'm done. If we would prop them up and support them for the work that they do, the tenure would be a lot longer. But
I agree 100%. I've been there.
I know you have. So it just didn't make any sense why they wouldn't help us. So I guess I got kind of we asked nice a lot, and we kept getting doors shut in our face and called troublemakers, and we experienced retribution of our own in different ways. You know, I used to serve on the SBDM, and then magically there was no record that I had ever been appointed, and so I served as academic coordinator at Shawnee, and when the new principal came in, the first thing she did was let me go. So it was a small job, but it was a paid job. I was considered part of the staff, and I feel like the superintendent, because she picked the principal, it wasn't chosen by the SBDM.
Right.
You know, the principal was loyal to the superintendent instead of to the people in the building. So that's another problem. Is
in this
priority
Bellwether
schools?
Report, as they're saying, no longer will SBDMs have too much power. Right, and the SBDMs are constantly the SBDMs are running the schools. So it's news to the SBDMs. They make do with the resources that they have.
There's a bill out right now too. I think it's SB 55 that we have to stop because it's trying to take power away from SBDMs as well. And so they get to make these misconceptions these priority schools are struggling, and if SBDMs were so great, why haven't they address that problem? Well, because you took our SBDM away, remember? There's not enough information out there for people to realize the cause and effect, and they spin it in a way that keeps everybody confused. No, if we could get our SBDM back, I think we could have picked our principal 2 principals ago, or kept Dr. Look there, who was doing a fantastic job in the turnaround. And things would be so different at Shawnee if there weren't models in place that require that you shake the school up every 3 years if you haven't improved your scores. The fact that they're serving, if they're serving a high needs population, why do you want to come in and shake things up every 3 years? If you were comparing them against year over year instead of against the school across town like Manual, Shawnee is compared to Manual, and then we're considered failing, and that's just not right. So we would still have a magnificent principal at our school if there weren't these state rules. So to follow up with what's the difference between Dear JCPS and Save Our Schools Kentucky. After we we're still doing some of it, but things are better than they were now that we've gotten rid of a superintendent who was willfully incompetent, in my opinion.
That's strong.
I don't really know how else to describe it. The fact that she would shut the door in my face when we would try to make things better, and just there's nothing else I can think of to describe that. But that is my opinion, so don't. I'm entitled to my opinion.
Yes, of course.
But nothing else makes sense. And so, I got accused of being a conspiracy theorist, but it's not a conspiracy if it actually turns out to be true, is it?
Right. That was the first thing that I thought when I saw the Bellwether Report and saw the Scala reporting from the Insider Louisville and Courier Journal was, wow, Gay was right. All along, everything she said, it's weird how all these CEOs and Catholic school hierarchy people and all these people just seem to be constantly agreeing on stuff. And I think they're getting together behind the scenes. People are just no, Gay, that's a conspiracy theory. Come on, that's out of control. You were right. Let the record show. Gay was right that she theorized the existence of Scala before anybody knew Scala existed.
I'm not the only one.
No, you're not the only one.
But I was
you're one of the
pretty
most vocal
vocal
ones. Yes.
And people would tell me that I was crazy, and I even sat down with somebody who told me that I was labeled a conspiracy theorist, and this was someone on Hargan's cabinet. who told me that, in fact, being seen with me was detrimental to his career, which
Wow.
was another mind-boggling thing, because that was before I was a thorn in anybody's side. I was still just trying to get meetings with people and have people understand that shutting down the Challenger Center and defunding the Challenger Center was a step in the wrong direction, but they did it anyway. Hopefully we can bring that back now that we know we have to compete with charters. That's another thing I want to get on people's radar, is that Challenger Center is still sitting there, and it would be a great opportunity for us to incorporate it in with science
It would be great.
and give us an edge over the charter schools that are going to be coming. So
They would talk about how important STEM is.
I know.
And defunding stuff
they
like
don't.
that.
They don't talk. They talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. At least the old administration didn't. So we were instrumental in raising awareness of Hargan's failings to address the needs of the most vulnerable population, and held a rally for her to step down. And in July, she actually did. So we consider that a success, one of the successes our organization was involved with. We won't take full credit, but it was certainly something
Now,
we were involved
is
with.
that an example of how you guys totally endorse and support the status quo about how you
Yeah,
JCPS
you know.
is fine? Yeah, sarcasm aside, right?
Yeah.
You guys are critics. Like, no
Absolutely.
one can look at the Dare JCPS website and think that you guys are full-throated supporters of the status
Not
quo
at
of
all.
JCPS.
Not
It's just,
at all.
it's amazing to me that anybody would make that critique of you or of Dear JCPS or people like
It's a
Rob
red
Matthew.
herring.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's totally red herring.
It's a red herring.
Right.
And so then when we realized that certain things were happening at the state level, high stakes testing was actually our first focus that we wanted to take to the state. And so we started Save Our Schools Kentucky a little over a year ago. No, actually, was that 2 years ago? It hasn't been very long. Dear JCPS has been around almost 3 years. I think Save Our Schools has been a little over 2. And so high stakes testing and accountability were the things that we wanted an opt-out clause so that parents could actually opt their students out of high stakes testing, because we felt like that we're feeding the monster.
Right.
If we could get people to stop taking the tests and let them think that their data is not reliable, then we can actually start getting back to meaningful instruction. Because one thing people don't realize is these high stakes tests don't even guide instruction. They don't get the scores back until the following year. They don't get
Right.
to know what they missed.
What are we supposed
It's
to do?
totally punitive. Totally punitive.
Yeah.
There's nothing meaningful with these tests. So we're not
And
saying
again, I want to point out that you get these scores after a fourth of the students that you just tested are gone.
yes.
And what good does it do you?
Yes. And again, we're not opposed to accountability, we're not opposed to testing, but we want it to be meaningful and we want it to be tied to instruction so that it benefits the student.
Right.
And so that was the first issue that we took on with high stake testing. And I went to a conference, I went to the MPE conference 2 years ago and heard Diane Ravitch speak, and light bulbs just started going off. That's when I think I first became aware that this was all part of a playbook. Like, I knew testing was a big part of the problem, but I didn't realize that it was because it was broken on purpose. Like, they wanted our schools to be labeled as failing so that they could come up with a solution, and that there was this massive playbook of things that when this happens, then this is what's next, and this is what's next. And so what I saw was, there were people from all over the country at this conference, and so I'm talking to the people in New Jersey, and I'm talking to the people in Massachusetts, and I'm like, so then where are you in this process? And they're telling me, and this is what just happened, and this is what's next, and charters is what was next for us, and then vouchers, then scholarship tax credits. Like, I could see the writing on the wall. And I brought it back here, and I tried to help my fellow Kentuckians understand the threat that we were under based on what's happening in 44 other states. Like, we don't have to just guess at what's happening. We just
Right.
simply read the paper.
Right.
We just have to leave the state of Kentucky and see what's going on in the states near us. Look at Ohio. Look at Indiana. Look at Tennessee. There are neighboring states that are suffering from the threats that charter schools have posed on their public school system. And then I get the argument, well, some charter schools are good. Okay, yeah,
Well, of course they are.
some public schools are good too, but
Exactly.
that doesn't prove anything. What we have to look at is what does coming in and taking money and support and resources and high-performing students out of our public school system do to
Right.
the public schools. Yes, the charters may do fine. Sometimes, in most cases, they only do as well as public schools, though. So we've destroyed our public school system for what? We've created duplicity. We've created lack of accountability. We've created fraud and corruption, and for no gain. So what if we could? If all these things we're identifying that charter schools can supposedly do that public schools don't,
Yeah.
then let's figure out a way to put that back into our public schools and keep the money and the students and the resources there.
Right. The people talk about charter schools the way that people talk about communism, which you point out all the examples of failed communist states, and they say, well, no one's ever done it correctly. Like, if we did communism correctly, everything would be fine. It's the same thing with charter schools. You're like, well, look at Ohio, look at Indiana, look at their test scores, look at their outcomes, and they're like, well, but we'll do it correctly, right? It's just like with Bevan's upcoming tax plan. It's like, wait a minute, didn't Kansas just do this? And wasn't it a huge disaster? Corporations fled the state, like, people were leaving, people were moving, trying to get away from this disaster.
Don't be Kansas.
Right, but again, it's this whole idea of, oh, we'll get it right this time, right? It's not the ideology that's flawed; it's its implementation. No, the ideology is flawed. Like, the idea that we can take this essential function of government, which is to train citizens or train young people to be citizens of that government, and give it to and just sell it to the highest bidder, where profit is the motive. Like, what does it matter if the kids are better citizens? What does it matter if the kids are innovators or scientists or even just like productive members of society? What matters is like that paycheck, right? I just don't see how that's ever going to be a valid replacement for what we have. Now, I will say that in places where some charter schools are working, they're working as a close component of public schools. Like, the only thing that distinguishes them from any public school is the fact that they're not run by the school board, right? They take public funds. They're susceptible to public records requests. Some of their employees are public employees, right? It's just the difference is it's going to this private, to this nonprofit that then makes decisions. But it still has the same levels of accountability. And that's what I'm worried about is not going to happen with Kentucky's charter schools.
Yeah. Our bill
not
is
going to be
not
the same level of accountability.
No, our bill is not a good bill. And we are the state that had CARA.
Right.
We invented education reform 28 years ago.
And accountability.
And accountability. And we are nationally recognized for the strides that we made 28 years ago. And in fact, when we talk to people across the country, they cite, like lawyers cite our case law all the time. We are a model of education reform. Now, again, not about status quo. It's time to tweak our model of education reform. Nothing is ever perfect enough to just be set on autopilot and left alone.
Right.
And so it's time for us to do education reform again in Kentucky, but that doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what this charter school bill is.
Yes.
This charter school bill, and we didn't talk about ALEC yet, I don't think.
We should.
We definitely should. A lot of the bills that we're seeing coming through our state legislature last year as well as this year have paragraphs that you can copy and paste and put into Google and find them in other states and on the ALEC website.
Okay, tell everybody what ALEC is.
ALEC it stands for American Legislative Exchange Council, and it's basically the legal arm for the Koch brothers machine, the Koch machine. And the Koch brothers are a batch of elite, wealthy, white, entitled men. Sounds kind of familiar to the start of our show, doesn't it?
Right. There's these two brothers, but there's a whole bunch of CEOs in their network, and
kind of probably an Illuminati of sorts
right.
at the national level, and they've basically been doing this. They've been undermining democracy for decades, and they finally came to Kentucky last year. Last year was the first year that actually paid to lobby in our state, and you saw a lot of ALEC bills get passed last year because we also did see the House flip to Republicans. So we've got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican governor. So there are no more checks and balances. There's nothing to stand in the way.
Just like at the national level.
Yes, there's nothing to slow it down and say, wait a minute, did we ask everybody their opinion and make sure that this isn't going to have any unintended consequences before we pass this bill?
Right.
And so there's a lot less opportunity for feedback before these bills are getting passed. And that's
it's just like with the tax bill at the national level. It was pure ideology. It wasn't based on any sort of actual economic science, like if we do this, then this will actually lead to prosperity. This is ideological statement. Tax cuts lead to prosperity. Let's cut all the taxes. Yep. And it's just fraudulent. Like, it's not going to be good. It's going to lead.
It's so what's frightening to me is it's so mythological.
Yes.
Like, I keep running into people who have opinions that are based on stereotypes that I can debunk in 1 minute if I just show them a report, but these are people in power. These are people that are actually sitting down in committee meetings and talking amongst themselves and saying, oh, we should pass a bill that does so-and-so, without ever going in and doing the research to determine if their myth is factual.
Right.
And so we're seeing laws based on rumor and stereotype instead of reality, and that's irresponsible and fraudulent.
Or they pay organizations to tell them that their myths are real.
Yeah,
There's a whole industry out there of think tanks and Pegasus Institutes who will just tell you whatever it is that you want to hear, and because they wrote it down and they called it a study, and the local press obediently the Pegasus Institute.
Oh no.
The
the number
they're a
of
think tank. They're a neutral, millennial think tank. It's just
no. Art Laffer is one of the consultants on the Pegasus Institute, and Art Laffer is the Laffer curve guy, and he's behind the Kansas destruction. So, we don't need Art Laffer or any of his ideology in Kentucky, because we can see what has already happened with that. And yet Pegasus is being quoted as if their theories are factual.
Right.
And it's frightening how there are people who truly believe that there are two sides to a story, and there are, and I don't mean there aren't two sides to a story, but one side is propped up with a lot of money and a lot of wealthy, powerful business elite, and the other side is just the people.
Right.
And the people don't have a big budget, and we don't have a big ability to organize against this misinformation that's being spread.
Yeah, the people have grassroots groups, and they have AstroTurf groups.
Exactly.
Highly funded AstroTurf groups.
Exactly. And, we try to just get the message out, and that's kind of what our group, Dear JCPS, and also Save Our Schools Kentucky, has been focused on doing, is educating people the best we can with probably less than, a $2,000 budget. We literally have done everything we've done through viral marketing media, low expense, non-expense, find somebody
Social
who'll make
media, things
copies
like that.
for us,
Here's the thing: is that I get why these guys tell these types of stories, because it centers them, right? It's like the one criticism of comic books is that they called them, the criticism was that they were adolescent power fantasies, right? So you have Spider-Man, you have Peter Parker, he's this nerdy science kid in high school, and then he gets all these powers, and unlike all the bullies, he uses his powers responsibly, right? He catches bad guys and so on and so forth. So of course, all of these, wealthy executives and CEOs, many of whom were born into great wealth, of course they're going to subscribe to a philosophy where the best of all possible worlds, is a world where these masters of the universe, these highly wealthy people, their decisions are elevated above everybody else's, right? It's this sort of a libertarian, not might makes right, but wealth makes right, right? And so of course, all their think tanks are going to find that that's the answer. We have to get rid of government regulation. We have to get rid of anything that would stand in the way of these, striding across the planet CEOs and magnates, just doing whatever they want, right? That's the whole Ayn Rand thing, is that, look, if these people do it, then that makes it right.
Yeah, but there are just certain things in our society that if there's not a profit to be made, nobody's going to do it. And protecting our water supply is one of them. And we've seen examples across the country now. Estill County right now is dealing with hazardous waste being dumped in their county, and the citizens are having to rise up. If you take regulations away, people do these things. They will dump hazardous waste in your drinking water.
Yeah, and then you get Kentucky representatives like Jim Gooch, who are going to bat 100% of the time for industries that are poisoning our drinking water and destroying our mountains and polluting our streams. And their solution to this is not to say, okay, look, look. If they said this, I could at least respect their honesty. If they actually said, okay, look, we don't care about you. What matters is corporate profits, and we are getting a lot of donations from these people, and that's why we're voting for mountaintop removal. That's why we're voting for groundwater stream pollution, because I don't care about you, you're the little people. If they said that, I'd be like, well, that's grotesque, but at least you're honest.
Yeah.
But what they say is, I don't believe in pollution, global warming is a myth, right? Mountaintop removal is actually good for the mountains. Here's this, surprise, contrarian conclusion to this, very obvious common sense issue.
Right.
And so, they have to do all these sort of mental gymnastics to first convince themselves that what they're doing is actually a good thing. And then they can hire their think tanks and institutes and pay for entire academic departments at universities to also generate these same conclusions, to show that this totally counterintuitive proposal, such as if you cut taxes, revenue will increase, right? There's a whole body of research on it, even though it's never worked, it's never been shown to work. But people cite the Reagan era, and yes, Reagan cut taxes early on, but then he raised taxes multiple times throughout his administration. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about that, right? And so there's this whole development of this mythology, as you put it, development of this sort of self-reinforcing ideology that we're the best people, we're the right people, we're the smartest people, and it is only right and proper that we be in charge of everything. And so, of course, all their little institutions are going to just replicate this same conclusion because they're the ones paying the bills.
Mm-hmm. And they're accountable to their stockholders. So these are publicly traded companies, and there's a lot of pressure on them to improve their earnings every year over year. Mm-hmm. So they're looking for ways to cut costs. And that's back to the charter school analogy. They're looking for ways to cut costs and service these students in the least costly manner. So that means pushing out the kids that are expensive or cutting corners. And when they save money, though, wouldn't you think that that money should go back to the public coffer? No, it goes to their shareholders. So, like, that whole dynamic should be so obvious to people that. Anyway, I wanted, if you have a couple more minutes, I wanted to talk about AROS, which is the Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools.
Sure, go ahead. We do have a couple more minutes.
We had a meeting on Friday to talk about how we're going to respond to the SCALA. And basically, we feel like it's possible that many of these 69 now, have gotten into this because, you're invited to a powerful group. Who wouldn't go if you're invited? You don't necessarily know what's going on, or maybe you send a representative, or maybe you don't even go, but, somehow your name got on the list because you were invited.
I can't imagine all 70 of these people are showing up to every meeting.
No, and I think it might be a different mix each time, certainly, but we think that they're hearing the story about, we need to fix public schools. And again, who doesn't want to get on board with that? That's a noble idea.
Let's do it.
But the solution itself and subverting democracy itself is what we would like to ask them if they truly meant to be a part of. And if not, we would like them to denounce the group and denounce the privatization of public education in particular for our group's concerns. And if they do, then we will be happy to remove them from the list of actions that we're planning for the next week.
So step one is
next month, I should say.
Approach all the publicly listed members and say, are you endorsing this education study group's conclusion? If not, you should quit SCALA.
Yes, you should denounce your involvement. Publicly denounce your involvement.
Yeah.
And if you're not willing to do so, then you should be prepared to see the citizens of this community respond.
What type of responses are we talking about?
We might be talking about picketing. We might be talking about boycotting. We might be just talking about making people aware of the fact that if you bank here, you're against public schools. Because there isn't two sides to this story. You can't be with us and with charters. You're either with us or you're against us when it comes to public education. And if we've made that point clear and they still continue to choose to go down that road, then anyone who supports public education, which is usually about 80 to 90% of the population, there is a fringe that still says, oh yeah, we need choice, but most, even people who send their kids to private schools still value the public schools. They know that there's a value for public schools in our society. If they want to send their kids to private school, that's great, and they do so out of their own pocket, and they respect that they honor that responsibility. So, but if we're citizens of this community and we're banking at a certain bank that is harming public education, then they have a right to move their money from that bank. And we expect that people will be interested in demonstrating their voting with their dollars, if you will. Today is Super Bowl Sunday, and we are encouraging people to not buy Papa John's pizza because he is one of the 69 on the list. John Schnatter is.
This is a big day for them.
It should be, yes. So if you're buying pizza for your game tonight, please consider buying from anyone other than Papa John's.
There's also a lot of local pizza places that are so much better.
Yes, I know. I think we posted it on our page, and most people said, "Oh, I stopped eating their pizza long ago," for a lot of various reasons, obviously.
Right. But they keep John Schnatter keeps giving us reasons to not support his company.
And we're even seeing we're having some dialogue with one of our state legislators right now on one of our pages where again they may have voted for charter schools last year, well-intentioned. But they're realizing the mistake of it this year. We can't fund it. It's not popular with the voters. We're waking up to the reality of the situation. Kentucky is a lot further ahead of the game than I think Koch brothers expected us to be.
Yes.
And so some of them are actually pretending like they didn't vote for it, even though they did. We actually had to push really hard to get a retraction in one of the papers, one of the Cincinnati papers. They finally did that today because Gina Huff Bunch was quoted as having not voted for charter schools and couldn't understand why everybody thought she had an anti-public education stance. Well, you go back and you look, and she did vote for charter schools, but she had a different last name then. So it was an honest mistake, but it seems like it took an act of God to get someone to actually retract the statement and make it correct. They want fake news out there. They want to pretend like they were in favor of charter schools all along. So, we have to stay on people and make sure that the facts stay relevant and topical.
Well, gang, we're going to have to stop right there. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. The show airs, of course, Sundays at 3 p.m., and this show will rebroadcast at Monday at 10 a.m. and Tuesday at 7 a.m. Right here on 106.5 FM, WFMP Louisville Forward Radio. It is also available as a podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, and our website. The website is fc2n.com. That's the letter F, the letter C, the number 2, and the letter N.com. We also tweet at FC2N Show on Twitter, and we can be found on Facebook as well. So please join From Classroom to Newsroom on social media. I'd love to hear your ideas for future guests and show topics, and that'll do it for today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for joining.
All right. Can you pop it back over to that button on the left? Yeah.